Hello, is this working? Can everyone hear me? Good. Welcome everyone. My name is Daniel Medin. It's a delight to be here. Along with Patrick Lemoine, who's seated right here, and Witold Szabłowski. The topic of our talk today is madness in power, and I'd like to give you a brief introduction to the books that we'll be discussing and what they do before I go into my first question. Patrick Lemoine, I've been concentrating on la santé psychique de ceux qui ont fait le monde, which is made up of several different chapters, providing first kind of potted biography of an important, you might say, historical world leader, and this goes from ancients into the 20th century. And then it begins to try to approach their psychic states and analyze those psychic states before concluding with a diagnosis and prescription. Witold Szabłowski has written a couple of books, sort of taking the same interesting angle of looking at power, but in this case by way of the chefs of different dictators. The first book, How to Feed a Dictator, considers the chefs and interviews with chefs of dictators from around the world, such as Pol Pot and Saddam Hussein and so on. The second book pursues this theme within a Russian context. The title is What's Cooking in the Kremlin, and you have a kind of overview of Russian history from the last Tsar to today, essentially, because I think that book was finished right before the war started in Ukraine. So those will be our topics. And I was interested while doing the preparation for this event. I found it quite interesting in the way that these books were talking to one another. And so I wanted to begin with a question that's kind of addressed to both of you. And you can jump in first, whoever feels most compelled. I'm curious as to what attracts you to power as a subject, right? Because in some ways these are both about leaders who have centralized power at one point or another, whether in different systems. You write about Charles de Gaulle, so it can even be in the case of democracy, as well as an emperor like Napoleon, or autocratic power, these dictators. Because power seems to be an important subject of both works. And I suppose the second part of this question is, what makes a tyrant such a compelling figure to write about and research?
So I can start, and I think we can just be in dialogue in that. I would say that for me, kitchen and cooking was actually more interesting, at least at the beginning. And the reason was my background, because before I became a writer, I was a chef. And I loved cooking. I loved spending time with other chefs. I loved being in the kitchen because chefs are amazing. And actually, after many years when I was interviewing and meeting chefs that cooked for dictators, I have a theory that actually it's just an accident. You need the same skills to become a chef and a tyrant. It's just a few moments of your life that decides which one you're gonna be. So actually, I spent a beautiful year in Copenhagen with chefs from Iraq who were in Iraq because they were expelled by Saddam Hussein. And I learned from them so much about cooking, but also so much about Iraq, so much about the connection between power and kitchen, and so much how food can influence politics and how politics influence food. So first thing I was looking for wasn't power and information about the power. I was looking for a way back to the kitchen. I just wanted to be with chefs again. I wanted to listen to their stories. I wanted to talk with them. That was my first reason. And then one day I realized, because after my cooking career, I moved back to Warsaw. I'm Polish and I live in Warsaw. I started working as a journalist, then I started working as a writer. I started writing books, and one day I realized that behind every political decision, behind every tyrant, behind every war and every decision that changes or shapes the world, there is a chef. There is someone who cooked the meal for this occasion. There is someone, you have Donald Trump making this war with Iran, and there is somebody.
And you have the guy who's making the burger at McDonald's for Donald Trump.
Actually, I talked with a guy who from the White House kitchen, and they don't do it at McDonald's. That's the worst part. They brought McDonald's equipment to the White House kitchen. I'm honest. They did it. Because Trump doesn't eat any other food. So, but anyway, whatever happens, whatever important political decision happens, you have a chef they are so smart. The chefs are so smart. They combine knowledge from so many different areas. And they have this small view, the kitchen door, and they observe, they analyze, and it's so interesting to talk with them. And then I realized, so part one was I just wanted to go back to the kitchen, but then I realized that when you have smart men like a chef, who combines the knowledge about, they have to be a good chef, you have to be a physician, mathematician, astrologist, an artist, you have to combine all those fields in one person. And they observe, and they see the politics being made, and they are so great to talk about the politics with and about power. So the power came as a natural next step. That was my case.
Avant de parler de mon thème, je voudrais juste.
Before I come to my theme, I just wanted to remind us of one of the first things Donald Trump said when he took over when he came to the White House, back to traditional American food, etc., burgers, pizza, etc., and French fries. Let's not forget that burgers are German, pizza is Italian, and French fries are French. So he was wrong on all three counts. In actual fact, the first question I asked myself when I decided to write this book was, does power make you crazy, or do you have to be crazy to seek power? And I think it's probably both. We know that when people come into power, it changes them. Nero was completely changed by his office. At the same time, people who pursue power are very particular people. So I decided to look for a model animal, a model of change. My first was a small fish from Lake Tanganyika in Africa, a cichlid. The male fish of this species are very beautiful, very colorful, and they live up at the surface of the lake. But then there's another group of males that are just brown, and they live down in the mud, down in their bottom dwellers, bottom feeders. And since the beautiful males that live at the top are very colorful, they are the ones that get taken by the eagles. When the ugly males come up to the surface, they become colorful. And they all parade at the surface of the water. In chimpanzee society, which is probably the closest to ours, there's probably the most political animal. They're always discussing things, negotiating. They carry out rapes, genocides. It's the only species that organize commandos to wipe out an entire group of competing chimpanzees. A chimpanzee who's seeking power doesn't have the same behavior as another. And the psychological abnormalities in power are closely linked. If you want to seek power, that is suspicious, and if you're in power, it's suspicious because you're going to change. I hope I'm not going to offend anyone when I say that in areas where there's the greatest degree of depression is teachers because you have a whole class under your power, and psychiatrists are the others. In psychiatric hospitals, they are kings, and they subjugate their population. So these are two very fragile fields where there's a high rate of depression. So choosing a career where you have power over people who are often considered inferior, like children are in some classrooms, is a sign of fragility.
For you, because the theme of this festival is madness, and earlier you discussed madness in the creative arts with Rosa Montero, and I'm curious because you've also done a book that focuses on geniuses, but you've also written a lot about writers, and how would you distinguish writers from politicians and the kinds of people that you analyze in this book itself? And I suppose there's another question which is related, is can traits that appear pathological ever become advantages in the pursuit of power, right? I think Rosa mentioned there are certain ways in which things that appear to be a source of suffering can also produce, along the lines of Baudelaire, fleur de mal. You know, there's something, that creative work that is productive and brilliant can somehow come out of it. Are there political advantages to be gained from some of these other forms of madness?
Alors c'est une question compliquée que vous posez parce que, à mon avis, il y a aucun
In my opinion, there's no relationship between writers and dictators. These are very different populations. By their very essence, writers have no power. Unless you're talking about writers seeking power. Marcus Aurelius, Victor Hugo, who became member of parliament, Lamartine, who almost became the president of the Republic. But writers are in a solitary dialogue with their pen or their keyboard, and they don't have any power. So I think that that writers are completely different from heads of state and dictators. But at the same time, in the book about the mental health of those who made the world, I chose 20 historical figures, very important ones, King David, Solomon, Churchill, Stalin, Hitler, who these was normal. And there were only 2 out of the 20, King Solomon and General de Gaulle, who, in my opinion, were not mentally ill. But there's a huge degree of pathology in the others. Then there's Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is a wealth of information for psychiatrists. Some said she had hallucinations. So some said she was hysterical. Some said that she had other issues, but this is all wrong. She was quite well adjusted, except for anorexia. If you look at the history of Joan of Arc, she was not a shepherd. She was the daughter of someone of standing, and she sued her father to cancel the marriage contract he'd signed. If you go to Thun in Moselle, you can see the documents asking for her marriage contract to be cancelled. She was afraid of losing her virginity. Her entire life revolved around this. She used to be called the Virgin of Orléans. She was examined when she met King Charles and by another doctor under the Inquisition. So we have a very specific clinical description. We know her diet, her measurements, her weight, and we know that at age 18, she still didn't have her period. She only ate once a day a thin soup with a few a crust of bread, and she had no breasts, no buttocks. She was very thin and looked like a boy. But this anorexia gave her incredible energy. She led armies. I think that she wasn't afraid of the soldiers. She probably whacked them with her sword. She'd probably see off the prostitutes that they brought to the camp. She was not afraid to talk to the archers. Gilles de Rais was not an easy person to deal with. So Joan of Arc was anorexic, but her anorexia saved France. Why? Well, when you're wearing a coat of armor, it takes about an hour to put the armor on, and she needed two people to help her. And so anorexia is an advantage, because since she wasn't eating, she wasn't eliminating anything, and she never had her period. Can you imagine in the siege of Orléans if she had to take her armor off because she needed to pee, and then an hour later, when they got the armor back on, the battle could begin? So this is how she was able to lead her armies to victory. What cost her life was her fear of losing her virginity. She was captured by the Burgundians, who don't forget that she was acquitted by the Inquisition when she was handed over to them. She was extremely well educated. She knew about theology. She was a great horse rider. So she managed to succeed in her investigation by the Inquisition. The English were furious, and they decided to take her back to England and hand her over to the soldiers and let the army rape her. And she said, no, actually, Saint Marguerite, Saint Michael have talked to me, and she decided that she would rather be burned at the stake than lose her virginity or be raped. So if you want to call it pathology, anorexia, fine, but it saved France, but it made her lose her life.
Your work depends heavily on testimony, or at least in these two books. This is obviously not an encounter with the history books, but rather with conversations that you've had with chefs. And the people you interview may not be reliable historians, but the stories they tell are often deeply revealing. And so I wanted to ask you a question about the last book, about what's cooking in the Kremlin, which we'll come back to a little bit later, and ask you, for example, what these conversations have taught you about Russia that you could have never learned from books alone.
Generally, non-fiction writing. Yeah, it does. Generally, non-fiction writing is pretty much about trusting to people you talk with. Of course, I'm doing my best to do the fact-checking. For example, when I was working on the book about dictators, I had many situations. For example, the key character in that book was the private chef of Saddam Hussein. But whenever he was recalling some dialogue between him and Saddam, I just had to trust him. Like, I cannot ask Saddam. I just have to trust to the chef. But whenever it was possible to do the fact-checking, I would do that. Like, for example, I found the private chef of Saddam Hussein just to check if what the chef was telling me is true or not. When I was interviewing the chef of Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda, I was doing absolutely the same. I found 2 sons of Idi Amin to confirm the informations, because I wasn't sure if what the chef is telling me, it's just his imagination or is it true. But at the end of the day, when you work with the witnesses of the history, especially if you talk with the chefs, you know, we have to trust the chefs. If you go to a restaurant, you have to trust to a chef. You have to trust that he's not trying to poison you. And the same when you're talking with a chef, you have to trust him that, okay, probably this happened, or at least something similar to this happened. But generally, whenever I did the fact-checking, their stories were relevant or confirmed. What did I learn, what I wouldn't normally learn? And I would, actually, it's better if I stay with the dictator's book, because I have much better answer to that question in this book. I think that I saw the real faces of the dictators because I had the chance to talk with their personal chefs. Dictatorship is generally about lying. To become a dictator, you have to learn how to manipulate people, how to manipulate crowds. But you lie to your nation, you lie to your prime ministers, your ministers, you lie to your wives, you cheat on them. It's generally about cheating all the time. But there is two people a dictator cannot lie to, because they know true. You can be Saddam Hussein. You can tell your nation that you can swim through the Tigris River 40 times a day, but then your doctor will do the blood tests and he will know you're weak and you have to take a rest. So your personal doctor is a person you cannot lie to. And the second person is your personal chef, because you cannot eat food you hate for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. The chef of Fidel Castro was with him for 55 years. So you cannot eat the food you hate for 55 years. And I remember the moment when I had this illumination, is not the right word, but the moment when I understood that for the first time. Well, I was talking to a chef of Pol Pot. And you know, Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, was one of the most horrible regimes of the 20th century. They were killing people. You know, we would all be killed just for wearing this, for glasses, for shoes. They were killing people because they were the bourgeois. They were the rich. They were the ones who were not able to be re-educated. And I remember when his personal chef told me that at the same Pol Pot who was killing people for wearing glasses was asking her, the personal chef, to bake a fresh baguette for himself every morning. And that was the first moment when I understood that I can see the real face of a dictator, that when I speak with the chefs, they are the people who know the real faces of the chefs, and those are the real stories of the dictators.
Patrick, I have a question. I'm going to go back and forth between the present and the past and your sources. As a psychiatrist, because you do clinical work, what is the difference between diagnosing someone you've met and treated and analyzing a historical figure through documents and testimonies alone? What are the limits and, in certain cases, perhaps the advantages of working from written sources?
C'est une très bonne question, je trouve.
Very good question. I am a psychiatrist. Nobody's perfect. And as a psychiatrist, this was often analyzed with videos, but psychiatrists within 45 seconds have already come up with a diagnosis. And then the rest of the time comes to confirm or not the diagnosis. Same thing in general medicine. Diagnosis is very intuitive, and then the rest of the time is to check whether you've made a mistake or not. It's not quite the same to analyze Julius Caesar or King Solomon, or analyzing de Gaulle, where I've got documents, I can see recordings of him, videos of him. But what I've realized is that, in the end, I love clinical practice. I love taking care of people. I'm a caring machine. And despite my old age, I continue taking care of people, healing people. And I don't think they mind. And this eureka moment where you say, I know exactly what's wrong with him or her. Well, I felt the exact same thing while I analyzed all these heads of state and geniuses. There's the same eureka moment, and sometimes it takes several weeks to come up with a diagnosis. If you have to deal with old documents, looking at Alexander the Great, you don't have a plethora of documents. You have some, but you do know about his father's psychology. He was a psychopath. You also know about his mother's psychology, but we don't exactly know why he died. Probably the consequences of his alcohol, of his drinking problem. And after a while, you say to yourself, yes, he was an alcoholic, and he had borderline personality disorder. Once I had this eureka moment, the rest ensued, and I was able to decipher his life. Talking about Charles V, he used to be the most powerful man of his time. His empire didn't see the sun set, and it was the great empire of all times. Charles V didn't seek power. He was just born in the right family. That's it. And as soon as he could, he stepped down from power. So the most powerful man in history abandoned power whenever he had the opportunity to do so. He then went to a convent where he lived fairly well. But once he went to the convent, he asked what people thought of his rule. He organized his own funeral. He dressed as a monk, and he was in the crowd and listened to the people around him talk about himself. He was bulimic, eat less game, eat less cabbage because he had gout. But this man was very mystical. The Valladolid controversy, pardon my pronunciation, was absolutely extraordinary. This guy had a great sense of ethics. He was a firm believer, and he'd heard that the Dominicans didn't treat Indians in South America properly, and he decided a moratorium. He decided to stop all imports, all conquests, until they hadn't decided on a critical issue or not, which was whether the savages had a soul or not. So there was a theological debate that was organized in Valladolid between the Jesuits and Dominicans whether the savages had a soul or not. The Jesuits defended the savages, and the Dominicans did not. There's a very legal argument that took the cake. Those who said that they did not have a soul said they're savages, and you know what? They eat each other up. And someone else said, well, if they eat each other up, that means that they eat humans and therefore they have a soul. And that's the argument that won the debate. Charles V said, okay, fine. From now on, these Indians will no longer be our slaves. Although the same logic did not apply to the Africans. I find this is absolutely extraordinary because this man who was psychologically very fragile did something absolutely extraordinary, something very ethical, just by deciding a moratorium and deciding on a religious issue.
Witold, I'm going to bring you back to Russia. I'm sorry. Well, I suppose this is a two-part question because you completed the book of How to Feed a Dictator, and it didn't stop, right? You've taken a very similar approach, and you've applied it to, we might say, the Russian 20th century and the beginnings of the 21st century. And so I'm a little curious as to what brought that about, beyond what I can tell, which is as a Polish journalist in the proximity of Russia, because you began this project before the invasion. What brought this project about? What motivated it? And then I suppose the second question is, it's related to something that I've experienced as a reader, is looking back at where we are now through the perspectives in the book, which is to say from the kitchen. And it means that all of a sudden I begin to process the death of Navalny, or the place of poisoning within the approach. This and this is something that is not new. This existed beforehand in the East Bloc. Poisoning is a particular kind of art, but one that you might say had its origins in the kitchen too, right? So the second half of the question, if the first is how did you choose this project, or what led to this particular project, is I suppose what role does food and poisoning play in Putin's world, or the Russia of today?
So the first part was, I already wrote the book about chefs that cooked for dictators. And then I was looking for something similar, but not really how to feed a dictator part 2, but something, again, about chefs, politics, power, but a bit different. And then I had this idea about writing about Russia, because Russia has a very interesting approach when it comes to food and politics. I think they are, unfortunately, very smart, because they know how to use food in diplomacy, in building, how to use it as a tool to build their empire. I don't think many countries know how to use it. They really masterminded that. And shortly speaking, the book is history, is a guide in Russian history. I start with the chef who cooked for the last Tsar and was executed with him. I just met his grandchildren. But then I go to the chef of Stalin, chef of Lenin, chefs that cooked during World War II, chefs from the Chernobyl nuclear plant. And I end up interviewing and getting close with the man who cooked at the Kremlin for over 30 years. And we became, his name was Viktor Belayev. We became actually very close. The book was written and I did the research before the horrible invasion in Ukraine began. So I had the chance to be in Russia frequently. I had the chance to really spend a lot of time with Mr. Belayev. And the stories he told me were very unique. So I think it's a unique picture of how Russia is using food and how important the food is when it comes to making politics. There are even little menus from many presidential visits, including President Macron when he visited, but also many other. The last menu I have in the book is from the meeting of Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump in Alaska. And poisoning. I could talk a lot about poisoning, but generally speaking, they've been doing this for quite a while. They began even before the Bolsheviks came to power, like their secret service, Ochrana. They had a special office that was specialized in inventing or trying new poisons. You might not know, but Stalin poisoned the wife of Lenin. He hated her. He thought she was very close to stop him from getting the full power. And she loved cakes. She loved everything that was sweet. So Stalin sent her a beautiful cake for her birthday. And she ate it. And she died. So they are poisoning many people. They have a long history of poisoning people. They poison each other. Like there are gossips. It's a political, it's a theory, but there are many proofs that it might be true that at least 2 of the first secretaries of the Communist Party were poisoned. First one was Stalin. His death is like, there is so many theories around his death, like, you know, that nobody was allowed. Doctors were not allowed to his room for many hours. That's probably how long the poison needed to work. And the second was Brezhnev, who was also probably poisoned. Well, I never wish anything bad to anyone, but I'm waiting for the third leader to Russia to be poisoned. I hope it's gonna happen. But yeah, poisoning is a kitchen, and using food in diplomacy and in politics has a long tradition in Russia. And I can say the same about poisoning. It's also a long tradition. They use it in diplomacy. They use it in changing the power, etc.
It's very.
J'ai une question pour vous. J'ai travaillé Staline.
I have a question for you. I worked on Stalin in my book. Stalin was one of the biggest paranoid people that have ever lived. He thought he was persecuted and he mistrusted everyone. So what about the tasters? Heads of state and kings often had tasters, and it would be frowned upon to have a taster now, because if the taster dies, it's also bad for the president. So the question of the tasters doesn't make sense anymore. But here's my question. Since Stalin was so wary, how did he manage not to be poisoned? Did he have a taster? Did he have techniques for testing his food? He was terrified of being poisoned. He didn't leave the Kremlin for his entire reign, except once, where he went to Yalta in a armored caravan. Otherwise, he would stay in his bunker. So what measures did he take to not be poisoned?
Yeah, firstly, all the dictators, they have food testers. That's common for all of them. But Stalin's case is very interesting because Stalin's personal chef was his very close friend from his childhood. His name was Alexander Ignatashvili. They both grew up in Georgia. And Stalin really trusted to this man. Like, Stalin didn't trust to anyone, but that was his childhood friend. So he thought, okay, at least this one is not going to do any harm to me. But still, just in case, his wife, the chef's wife, was sent to Gulag just as a hostage, just to be sure that the chef doesn't try to poison him anyway. So one guarantee was the friendship, the long-term friendship. But second guarantee, and Stalin, as you know, Stalin was doing this quite a lot. When he didn't trust to someone, he would send a child or a partner to Gulag and keep it there. Just this person knew how to behave. So that was the case of the chef. His beloved wife, he really loved his wife, Ignatashvili, the chef. So the wife was sent to Siberia, and she was there when her husband was cooking for Stalin.
I don't think the cooking was very good in the Gulag, was it? To come back to what you were saying about the fact that when Stalin was dying, nobody was allowed into the room for at least 24 hours, maybe even 36 hours. The reason might be to give the poison time to act. I don't really think so, though. I think that he had killed all the doctors. All the doctors had already been killed off. So none of the ones who remained dared to go in and see if he was still alive. If he was alive, they might be in danger. So everybody left him to die in peace. Nobody wanted to go into the room. This is extreme paranoia.
Yeah, but at the same time, you had Beria, the chief of KGB, the chief of Secret Service, who was standing close to the door and not letting anybody in. Oui. And Beria succeeded after Stalin. And the two times that are suspicious, the two times the historian thinks that the leader of Soviet Union might have been poisoned, the successor was the chief of the KGB. And I don't think of course there is no proofs for that, but I don't think it's by accident.
Ouais. Mais Beria est sûrement un des plus grands criminels.
Beria was probably one of the biggest criminals of all time. Putin was also the head of the KGB at one time.
I mean, I think there's another path that one could take that will perhaps leave aside about reason and paranoia as a topic in terms of madness, because part of paranoia involves it's a mix of reason and unreason, and I think some of the characters in these books have inhabited that state quite often. But I want to ask another question to both of you, and I want to make sure that I leave enough time for other people to ask questions to you both. Both of your books face the same challenge. The further back that you go in history, the fewer reliable sources. And I suppose this is a question, if you could bring one historical figure back to life and interview them for your work, who would it be and what would you ask?
Un grand faible pour Jeanne d'Arc.
I have a soft spot for Joan of Arc, but I also like King Solomon. I think King Solomon was one of the only people who stood up to Yahweh. Yahweh was not happy. He always said, there's only one God and I am that God. There's only one God you can worship. There aren't any other gods. You must worship me. And Solomon had a very active diplomatic life. He married the daughter of the Pharaoh. He married the daughters of all the major emperors in order to make peace with all these nations. And since he was a very gallant man and a good husband, he erected a temple to Osiris for his Egyptian wife, and other temples for his other wives. So he was a very gallant man. And Yahweh said, this is not good. And he said, I don't care. I want to have a temple for the gods of each one of my wives. Yahweh stood down and punished his son instead. This is a story from the Bible, obviously, but in the entire Bible, he's the only one who ever stood up to Yahweh. And Yahweh in this story is a man, obviously, a very strong man, a different man from the God we see in Genesis. So I'm proud of Solomon, and I think he was in good mental health. But his predecessors, we don't have a lot of documents, but Saul was bipolar and delusional. Music therapy was invented for Saul. Every time he was falling into melancholia, his future son-in-law, David, would be called in to play music, and that would calm him and heal him. And then he would go into a manic phase and become delirious, and he would try to throw a spear at his future son-in-law, and who would have to jump out of the window. What's surprising, very surprising, is that King David, who succeeded Saul, who committed suicide, King David was not delirious, but he was bipolar, with well-documented episodes in the Bible where he's depressed, and a manic episode, which is very funny. He comes back from a military victory, and he's very joyful, and he's going on the windy road up to Jerusalem, and he starts to sing and dance, and he didn't have any underwear on, and he had a short uniform. And his wife said, listen, you're singing and dancing in front of the people and everyone can see you with no underwear. Is this a good thing for a king to do? I think he was in a manic phase then. I would have given him an antipsychotic drug, whereas I would have given lithium to King David. Because in my book, not only do I give the diagnosis, but also the treatment.
And Witold, maybe the cook of King Solomon?
Yeah, I would like to talk with this chef that I mentioned, with Alexander Agnatashvili, the man who cooked for Stalin, because I think he had such an interesting life. He was a professional wrestler in his young years. He grew up with Stalin, so he knew how the monster was born. And he spent a lot of time with him. They were very close. And then he ended up in such a horrible situation. And I just wanted, because I'm much more interested in interviewing the chefs than dictators. Maybe I just like talking about food, but for me, he would be my number one, definitely.
But then what would you ask?
I would ask about the beginning of the war, because his wife was German, and the Germans attacked Soviet Union, and he was having German wife, cooking for Stalin, living so close, because he was living as a trusted man. He was living at Stalin's dacha. There must have been so much pressure on him, and people who knew him personally, people who remembered him, I had a chance to talk with such a people. They said he was always in a good mood. He was singing a lot. He was playing balalaika. So I would really like to talk with this man, just trying to figure out how he managed to be in a good mood in such a horrible situation.
Donc, si je comprends bien, tous vos
So
chefs
if I
cuisiniers,
understand,
ils allaient plutôt bien.
all of your chefs were in pretty good mental health.
Yeah, and all of them, that was my biggest surprise, that they were all very nice people. And I think dictators, they have this habit of choosing a nice person to work in the kitchen. Somehow they know that you can feel it in the food if a nice person prepared that or a bad character.
C'est une belle idée, ça.
It's a nice idea.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions. I don't see terribly well. I can succeed this far. That's yeah.
J'aurais une question, vu que vous parlez de dictateurs, je me suis toujours
Since you've been talking about
parce que je le suis
dictators,
moi-même,
I've always been interested
traité qui a un dictateur. Non, pas dictateur, flexitarien.
in
Sur ce peintre raté qui a mis à feu
in a
son,
painter
l'Europe, depuis les années 30.
who started in the 1930s. There's Hitler, who was a failed painter. He was a vegetarian,
Je sais pas si c'était
I
ça.
think.
Il était hypochondriaque. donc
He was
il
He was a hypochondriac. He was always afraid of falling ill.
Alors que je veux dire, c'est quand même quelqu'un qui
And yet, you don't understand my question? I don't understand who you're talking about. Sorry, I'm talking about Hitler, but I may not have said his name because I have trouble actually saying it.
Qui aussi, par exemple, a ordonné le massacre de tous
And yet, this is the person who ordered that 250,000 mentally ill people be murdered. So I was wondering about his relationship with food. Did he have a chef? Did Hitler have a chef? I don't know. I haven't heard of a lot of other dictators that were vegetarians. But my question is about Hitler's relationship with food. If you could talk to Hitler's chef, if he had a chef, what questions would you ask, given that he was vegetarian, which is rare at the time? And what connection would you be able to make between his power and his relationship to food?
Yeah, he was a vegetarian, and his chef. He had many chefs. He had another chef for bakery, another for soups. He had plenty of chefs. His baker died just 7 years ago, I think. She was 102. She was living in Berlin. And she was just a young girl during the wartime. She was a young girl forced to work for him in his bunker. Nobody asked her if she wants to work for Hitler or not. And then when he was in Berlin, his personal chef, just one out of probably 20 people working for him, the last one remaining was with him in the bunker in Berlin. And there was a very interesting discovery in Innsbruck, because that chef, the last one, was from Innsbruck. And her letters to her sister were found, I think, like 5 years ago. A local professor from Innsbruck, one elderly lady died, and the family realized that she has a collection of very interesting letters. they didn't know exactly what were the letters about. So they brought it to the local university and they realized that those are letters of the private chef of Adolf Hitler written to her sister. So we know pretty much about his diet. We know about his last meal. We know about his eating habits. We know pretty much. He was a vegetarian, yeah.
Oui, c'est vrai que je me suis posé la question.
Yes, I've often wondered about that, and I tried to understand why he was vegetarian, but I don't think I found the answer, because in actual fact, there are many reasons why one would become a vegetarian. The most often mentioned is the ethical reason. We shouldn't be allowed to kill animals. We shouldn't. Cows create a lot of pollution. A lot of vegetarians give these reasons nowadays. But in practice, there are a lot of vegetarians who just don't like meat, and it stems from a neurosis. They are vegetarians because it's fashionable, but actually they just can't stand to eat meat. We have a friend who's like this. We thought her vegetarianism was a philosophical stance until one day she picked up a piece, something which had meat in it, and she didn't realize, and she bit it, and she ran out of the room in a panic, and we realized that it was more of a psychological problem. So I would say that Hitler probably had a meat phobia because he was extremely disturbed. If you look at his biography, it's absolutely incredible. His intelligence, his IQ was not very high. He failed at everything he tried in life. He never graduated from his school. He was cowardly. In Austria, he got a doctor to write a note so that he could not do his military service. Then, in the end, he had to do his military service, but he managed to get himself in a position where he wouldn't have to see battle. He got himself assigned to the mailroom. But anyway, he ended up getting injured in the thigh and in the eye, and he ended up in the hospital. He ended up half blind, but he recovered from both injuries. He recovered his sight in the hospital. There was a Protestant pastor who said to him, Germany has lost the war. Sorry, this is not Hitler. This is someone else. Sorry, it is Hitler. This is when he focused on the Jews. This is after the First World War. And he said the reason we lost the war is because of the Jews. And his sight came back. So he probably was having hallucinations. He was addicted to cocaine. He had Parkinson's disease at the end of his life. He had phobic and neurotic reactions. And if I had to give my opinion, it's a speculative opinion, but I would say that he had a phobia of meat.
Question? I think there's something back there.
Thank you very much for the presentation, for the discussion. It was very interesting. I have a question regarding the diagnosis of mental health conditions in people who passed away a long time ago. Mainly since we know that these diagnostic criteria, they very often change, right, shift with time, and that there are many also cultural factors that play a role in how we perceive mental illness. I was wondering, how do you integrate this when you're studying these historical figures? What are the means of kind of looking at the cultural context and at what was normal and what was abnormal, and what do we know about this today?
Il est vrai que les critères diagnostiques.
It is true that diagnostic criteria evolve, but flu 400 years ago is the same as a flu today. Schizophrenia, for instance, may be tainted by culture, but not as much as that. Bipolarity, that changes very little. It's quite stereotypical. If you look at the Bible, look at the mood swings of one biblical figure and Winston Churchill, it's very similar. Now, we can't necessarily fine-tune the diagnosis of Alexander the Great, but he was an alcoholic. He killed his best friend when binge drinking in Greece, I think it was. These are hard facts. The pathologies I talk about in my book don't change over time. I might have a hard time using the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, for my diagnosis, but this manual was meant for research purposes and not necessarily to help physicians take care of their patients. Its scope was extended. This type of international classification does not help care for patients. I worked in Stanford as a researcher in a lab for the DSM-3 at the time publication. People worked exactly like me. Clinical criteria have not changed that much over time. There's an anecdote I find very interesting. It's Hippocrates and Democritus. And they would laugh a lot. People around him thought he was making fun of them. They called Hippocrates, who was the greatest expert at the time, and he carried out psychiatric diagnosis. He interviewed Democritus. Who said, well, I'm really interested in looking things around me and finding what's funny around me. And Hippocrates finished his diagnosis by saying he's fine. Democritus, I think, was a maniac in the middle of a maniac episode.
I'd like to thank our authors, Patrick and Witold, if we can give a round of applause, please. And maybe you can continue clapping for a moment in recognition and appreciation for our interpreters, too. Their books are for sale. They'll be available upstairs, and buy one, have it signed.